The animal shelter smelled like bleach and wet fur. Eli Parker stood just inside the door, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. He wasn't here because he wanted a dog. He was here because his mother had insisted, "It'll be good for you." But Eli didn't believe in good anymore, not since the accident. The dogs barked, jumped, and wagged their tails, desperate for attention. Eli ignored them all. Then, at the very last kennel, he stopped. A German shepherd sat motionless in the shadows, his fur patchy, one eye cloudy, the other a sharp amber. He didn't bark, didn't whine, just watched Eli like he already knew him. Something about the dog's stillness made Eli crouch down. That's when he saw it, a worn brass tag hanging from the dog's collar. He squinted, then read the words aloud. "If you found me, someone still believes I matter." Eli's breath caught. Why would a dog no one wanted carry a message like that? And why did it feel like those words weren't just for the dog, but for him? Behind him, the shelter worker sighed. "That one's different. Makes people feel things they don't want to feel." Eli didn't care. For the first time in months, he spoke without thinking. "What's his name?" "Shadow," the worker said. "No chip, no owner, just that tag." Eli reached a hand toward the gate. Shadow didn't move, didn't growl, just waited. And in that moment, Eli knew this wasn't just a dog. This was the beginning of something. The car ride home was silent. Shadow sat in the back seat, his nose pressed against the window, watching the world blur past like a forgotten memory. Eli kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror, half expecting the dog to vanish, like maybe he'd imagined the whole thing. But Shadow was real. His fur was matted, his ribs slightly visible under his coat, and his breathing steady like he'd been holding it in for years. Hannah, Eli's mother, tapped her fingers on the steering wheel. She hadn't said much since they left the shelter. Eli knew she was worried, about money, about time, about whether this was just another thing they couldn't handle. But when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he expected. "He's quiet," she said. "That's good. The apartment manager won't even know he's there." Eli nodded, but he knew the truth. Shadow wasn't just quiet. He was waiting for something. When they got home, Shadow didn't bolt inside like most dogs would. He stepped through the doorway like he'd been there before, his nose lifting slightly as he took in the scent of the house. Cinnamon from the pie Hannah baked yesterday, the faint mustiness of old books, the lingering smell of hospital antiseptic that never quite left his mother's scrubs. He didn't sniff around or explore. Instead, he walked straight to the living room and paused in front of an old, untouched dog bed in the corner. It had belonged to Rusty, Eli's golden retriever, who died 2 years ago. No one had moved it. Not even Hannah. Shadow circled the bed once, twice, then lowered himself onto it with a sigh so deep it sounded like relief. Eli's throat tightened. How did he know? That night, Eli lay in bed, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another heartbeat in the house, the slow, steady rhythm of Shadow's breathing from the floor beside him. He reached down, letting his fingers sink into the thick fur behind the dog's ears. Shadow didn't stir, just exhaled, like he'd been holding that breath too. The next morning, something changed. Eli woke to the sound of rustling. Shadow was standing by the bedroom door, his ears pricked forward, his body tense in a way Eli hadn't seen before. Not scared, not aggressive, just alert. Like he'd heard something the rest of the world couldn't. Then Eli heard it too. A voice. Faint. Muffled. Coming from outside. He crept to the window and peeled back the curtain just enough to see. There, standing at the edge of their yard, was a man. Tall, thin, his face hidden under a hood, but his posture stiff, like he was forcing himself to stay still. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking at Shadow. And Shadow was looking back. The man took a step forward. Shadow's lips twitched. Not a growl, not a snarl, but something in between, a warning, a memory. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees at the edge of the property. Eli's heart pounded. Who was that? He turned to Shadow, but the dog was already settling back down, his eyes half closed, like nothing had happened. But Eli knew better. That man hadn't just been a stranger. Shadow knew him, and that meant one thing. This dog had a past, a real one, and whatever it wasn't finished with him yet. The days passed in a strange, quiet rhythm after the mysterious man appeared in the yard. Eli tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just some neighbor who'd gotten lost, or someone who recognized Shadow from before. But the way the dog had reacted, that subtle tension in his body, told Eli there was more to it. He found himself watching Shadow more carefully now, noticing the small things, how the dog's ears would twitch at certain sounds, how he sometimes stared at the tree line behind their house like he was waiting for something, or someone. Hannah didn't seem to notice anything unusual. She was busy with double shifts at the hospital, coming home exhausted, her hands still smelling of antiseptic. But she did smile when she saw Shadow curled up on Rusty's old bed, his nose tucked under his tail. "He fits right in," she'd said one night, ruffling the fur between Shadow's ears. Eli nodded, but didn't tell her about the man. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he didn't want to worry her, or maybe because some part of him knew this was between him and Shadow now. Then, one afternoon, the past came knocking. Eli was in the backyard with Shadow, tossing a frayed tennis ball half-heartedly. Shadow didn't chase it like other dogs would. He just watched it roll away, then looked back at Eli like he was humoring him. That's when the gate creaked open. Eli spun around, his pulse jumping. It wasn't the hooded man. It was an older woman. Small, hunched slightly, her silver hair pulled into a messy bun. She wore a faded floral dress and carried a wicker basket over one arm. Her eyes, sharp and clear despite her age, locked onto Shadow immediately. "Well," she said, her voice rough but warm. "I wondered where you'd gone." Shadow went completely still. Then, slowly, his tail gave a single hesitant wag. Eli frowned. "Do you know him?" The woman smiled, but there was something sad in it. "Oh, I knew him, back when he was Juno." Eli's breath caught. Juno, the name from the tag. The woman stepped closer, her knees creaking as she crouched down. Shadow didn't move toward her, but his ears were forward, his gaze steady. "You're looking after him now, are you?" she asked, glancing up at Eli. Eli nodded, suddenly feeling like he was standing at the edge of a story much bigger than he'd realized. "Who are you?" "Myrtle Granger," she said, straightening up with a grunt. "I used to live next door to George Whitman. That's who this one really belongs to." She nodded at Shadow. Or did, anyway. Eli's mind raced. George Whitman, the name on the tag, the man who'd left to Shadow, or Juno with that message. Is George the one who was in our yard the other night? Myrtle's eyebrows shot up. "George was here?" She shook her head. No, George hasn't left Glen Hollow in years. Not since... She trailed off, her gaze drifting to Shadow again. Not since Emma died. The name hung in the air between them. Eli didn't have to ask who Emma was. He could see it in the way Shadow's ears twitched at the name, the way his posture shifted ever so slightly. Someone important, someone gone. Myrtle sighed and reached into her basket, pulling out a small wrapped package. "I was bringing you some muffins," she said, handing them to Eli. "But now I think maybe I was supposed to bring you this instead." She dug into the basket again and produced an old photograph, the edges slightly curled with age. Eli took it carefully. The photo showed a young woman with long chestnut hair, laughing as she knelt beside a much younger shadow, Juno, his fur sleek and dark, his eyes bright. Behind them, a tall, thin man stood on the porch steps, his hand resting on the woman's shoulder. His expression was hard to read, but the way his fingers curled into the fabric of her shirt said everything. "That's Emma," Myrtle said softly. "George's daughter. And that's Juno, when he was just a pup. Emma's dog, really. He never took to anyone else the way he did to her." She paused, her voice dropping. "When she passed, George, well, he wasn't the same. None of us were." Eli stared at the photo, his throat tight. He understood now. Shadow hadn't just been abandoned. He'd been lost in the same way Eli had been since his dad died. Myrtle reached out and patted Shadow's head gently. "You take good care of this boy," she said to Eli. Then, to Shadow, her voice barely above a whisper, "And you take care of him too." As she turned to leave, Eli blurted out, "Wait, why did George let him go? If he meant so much to Emma." Myrtle paused at the gate. "Grief does strange things to people," she said. "Sometimes it makes us let go of the things we love most, just because loving them hurts too much." She gave Shadow one last look. "But I think maybe George knew Juno still had work to do." Then she was gone, leaving Eli standing in the yard with the photograph in one hand and 100 new questions swirling in his head. Shadow leaned against his leg, warm and solid. And for the first time, Eli wondered, had Shadow found him for a reason? The photograph burned in Eli's pocket as he walked through town with Shadow the next morning. Every few steps his fingers brushed against it, as if making sure it was still there. Myrtle's words echoed in his mind. Grief does strange things to people. He understood that better than anyone. After his father's accident, Eli had stopped talking for nearly 3 months. Words felt too heavy, too meaningless when the person who mattered most couldn't hear them anymore. Shadow, though. Shadow didn't need words. He just understood. The town of Willow Creek was waking up around them. Shopkeepers unlocking doors, the scent of fresh bread drifting from the bakery. Normally, Eli avoided the busier streets, sticking to the edges where fewer people would notice him. But today, he found himself slowing near the library, his eyes drawn to the bulletin board outside. Flyers for lost pets, community events, and, his breath hitched, a faded notice with a grainy photo of a German shepherd. The words beneath it were worn, but legible. Missing. Answers to Juno, last seen near Glen Hollow, reward for information. The date was from over a year ago. Eli's pulse quickened. He glanced down at Shadow, but the dog was staring at something across the street. A narrow alley between the hardware store and the post office. His ears were rigid, his body taut. Before Eli could stop him, Shadow pulled forward, his leash going slack as he padded toward the alley with quiet purpose. The alley was dim, smelling of damp concrete and old cardboard. At the far end, barely visible in the shadows, was the hooded man from the yard. He was crouched beside a dumpster, his back to them, but at the sound of Shadow's claws on the pavement he went still. Then, slowly, he turned. He wasn't old like George, younger, maybe in his 30s, with a gaunt face and eyes that looked like they hadn't slept in weeks. His hoodie was frayed at the cuffs, his jeans splattered with mud. When he saw Shadow, his expression cracked open. "Juno?" His voice was rough, disbelieving. Shadow didn't move. but his tail, usually so still, gave the faintest twitch. The man swallowed hard, his gaze flicking to Eli. You have him?" Eli's grip tightened on the leash. "Who are you?" The man hesitated, then reached into his pocket. Eli tensed, but all he pulled out was a dog tag, identical to Shadow's, except the engraving was different. "If lost, return to 144 Glen Hollow, reward." "I'm Daniel," the man said quietly, "Emma's brother." The name hit Eli like a punch. Emma, the girl in the photo, George's daughter, Shadow's, no, Juno's, first owner. Daniel's hand shook as he rubbed the tag between his fingers. "I've been looking for him since the funeral. Dad said he ran away, but I knew better. Juno would never have left her." His voice broke. "Not unless someone made him." Eli's mind raced. George had told Myrtle he let Juno go because the grief was too much. But Daniel was implying something darker. Shadow whined softly, the first sound Eli had ever heard him make. Daniel reached out, then stopped himself. "Is he okay?" Eli nodded. "He doesn't bark, doesn't play much, but he listens." A sad smile tugged at Daniel's lips. "Yeah, that's Juno. Emma trained him for that. She ... He trailed off, his eyes glazing over for a second. Then he blinked, refocusing. "You should know. He wasn't just a pet. Emma had a heart condition. Juno could sense when an episode was coming. He'd alert her, get help if she passed out." His voice dropped. "The night she died, he wasn't there. Dad had locked him in the garage." Eli's stomach twisted, because loving them hurts too much. A car honked on the street behind them, making both of them jump. Daniel straightened, his face closing off again. "You should go," he muttered. "If Dad finds out you have him—" "He won't take him back," Eli said fiercely. Daniel studied him for a long moment. Then, to Eli's surprise, he nodded. "Number, I don't think he will." He took a step back, melting into the shadows. "Just keep him safe, okay?" And then he was gone. Eli stood there, the dog tag heavy in his palm, Shadow pressing against his leg like an anchor. The pieces were starting to come together. Emma's death, George's grief, Juno's abandonment. But one question burned louder than the rest. Why had Daniel been hiding in their yard? And more importantly, what wasn't he telling them? The rain started that evening, a slow drizzle at first, then building into a downpour that rattled the windows and turned the backyard into a muddy pond. Eli sat by his bedroom window, tracing the path of raindrops with his finger, while Shadow lay at his feet, his chin resting on Eli's sneaker. The dog hadn't moved since they got home from town, his amber eye fixed on the door as if waiting for something, or someone. The encounter with Daniel had left Eli with more questions than answers, and the weight of them pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. Hannah knocked softly before pushing the door open, her scrubs swapped for sweatpants and an old college hoodie. "You okay?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. "You've been quiet all day." Eli hesitated. He wanted to tell her about Daniel, about the missing poster, about the way Shadow had looked at the man like he was a ghost. But the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he held up the dog tag Daniel had given him. "Do you know where Glen Hollow is?" Hannah frowned, stepping closer to take the tag. "It's an old neighborhood on the edge of town, mostly abandoned now." She turned the metal over in her fingers. "Where did you get this?" "Someone gave it to me," Eli said vaguely. They said Shadow used to live there." Hannah's expression softened. She handed the tag back and crouched beside Shadow, running a hand over his scarred front legs. "He's had a hard life, huh?" Eli swallowed. "Yeah, harder than we know." The storm worsened as night fell. wind howling through the trees and thunder shaking the walls. Eli lay in bed, listening to the creaks and groans of the house, Shadow's steady breathing the only thing keeping him grounded. Then, a sound. Not the storm, not the house. A knock at the front door. Shadow was on his feet in an instant, his body rigid, a low growl building in his chest. Eli had never heard him make that sound before. His blood turned to ice. The knock came again, louder this time. Eli crept into the hallway, Shadow at his side. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp outside. Through the rain-streaked window, Eli could make out a figure on the porch, tall, hooded. Daniel. But something was wrong. The man wasn't just standing there. He was leaning against the doorframe, one arm clutched around his middle like he was hurt. Eli's pulse pounded in his ears. He glanced at Shadow, whose growl had tapered into a whine. The dog knew Daniel, trusted him maybe, but that didn't mean it was safe. The knock came a third time, weaker now. Eli took a shaky breath and unlocked the door. Daniel stumbled inside, his hood falling back to reveal a face streaked with rain and something darker, blood. A gash above his eyebrow oozed crimson, and his left sleeve was torn, revealing a jagged cut along his forearm. Holy! Eli grabbed his arm without thinking. What happened? Daniel's breath came in short gasps. He knows. Who knows? George. Daniel's eyes darted to Shadow, then back to Eli. He knows you have Juno. A bolt of lightning lit up the room, casting sharp shadows across Daniel's face. I went to the house tonight, 144 Glen Hollow. I thought maybe I could find something. Proof. Proof of what? Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. That Emma's death wasn't an accident. The words hung in the air like the static before a thunderclap. Shadow let out a soft whimper, pressing against Eli's leg. Daniel wiped blood from his brow with a shaking hand. George was supposed to be out of town, but he was there, and he broke off, his gaze snapping to the window. We have to go. Now he's coming. Eli's stomach lurched. My mom. Wake her up, Daniel said urgently, but don't call the police. George is the police. The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. George wasn't just a grieving father. He was the town's retired sheriff. And he was coming for Shadow. The car tires crunched over gravel as Hannah sped down the back roads, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Rain lashed against the windshield in sheets, the wipers struggling to keep up. In the back seat, Eli clutched Shadow close, his fingers buried in the dog's thick fur. Daniel sat beside him, pressing a wad of napkins from the glove compartment to his bleeding forehead. The air inside the car smelled like wet dog and fear. Eli's mind raced. None of this made sense. Why would George, a retired sheriff, a grieving father, hurt his own son? Why was he so desperate to get Shadow back? And what did any of it have to do with Emma's death? The questions swirled in his head, but one thought rose above the rest. They were running from a man who knew how to hunt. Hannah glanced at them in the rearview mirror. Daniel, I need you to tell me everything. Now. Daniel winced as the car hit a pothole. Emma had a heart condition, congenital. The doctors said she might not live past 30, but she... His voice cracked. She didn't care. Lived every day like it was a gift. Juno, Shadow, was trained to alert when her pulse spiked. He saved her life more times than I can count. He took a shaky breath. But the night she died, Dad locked him in the garage. Said he was too distracting. Eli frowned. That doesn't prove. Emma never went anywhere without him, Daniel interrupted. Never. But that night, Dad insisted. Said they needed family time, just the three of us. His fingers tightened around the bloody napkins. She collapsed in the kitchen. By the time I got to Juno, it was too late. Hannah's grip on the wheel tightened. "And you think George let her die?" Daniel's eyes were hollow. "I think he helped." A chill ran down Eli's spine. Shadow whined softly, nosing at Daniel's hand like he understood every word. The car swerved as Hannah took a sharp turn onto an even narrower road. Old Mill Route, a winding back street that led out of town. "We need proof," she said. "Something concrete. Or we're just 3 people and a dog running from a respected ex-cop with a sob story." Daniel reached into his jacket and pulled out a waterlogged envelope. "I found this at the house. It was hidden in Emma's old desk." Eli took it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink smudged but still legible. A life insurance policy, made out to George, for $500,000, dated 2 weeks before Emma died. Eli's breath caught. "This is proof," Daniel finished grimly. Shadow suddenly stiffened, his head snapping toward the back window. Eli followed his gaze, and his heart stopped. Headlights, gaining on them fast. The headlights grew brighter in the rearview mirror, cutting through the rain like 2 glowing eyes. Hannah's foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine whining in protest as the car fishtailed on the slick road. Eli clutched Shadow tighter, feeling the dog's muscles tense beneath his fur. Shadow wasn't just alert now. He was vibrating with something deeper, something primal. His amber eye reflected the pursuing headlights, turning them into something monstrous. Daniel twisted in his seat, his injured arm braced against the door. "It's him," he breathed. "That's Dad's truck." The confirmation sent a jolt through Eli. This wasn't just some paranoid chase anymore. George Whitman, a man who'd supposedly been too broken by grief to keep his daughter's dog, was now hunting them down in the middle of a storm. The insurance policy crumpled in Eli's pocket suddenly felt heavier, the implications sinking in like teeth. Hannah took a sharp left onto a dirt road, the car lurching violently as they left pavement behind. Branches scraped against the windows like skeletal fingers. "Where does this lead?" she demanded, her voice tight. "Nowhere good," Daniel admitted. "Dead ends at the old quarry in about 3 miles. Eli's stomach dropped. A dead end, with George behind them. Shadow let out a low, rumbling growl, his gaze locked on the truck gaining behind them. Then, suddenly, he lunged forward, his nose pressing against the rear windshield. His ears flattened, his lips curled back. And for the first time since Eli had met him, Shadow barked. The sound was explosive, raw, more like a roar than anything Eli had ever heard from a dog. It filled the car, shaking the air with its intensity. Hannah gasped, her hands jerking slightly on the wheel. Daniel went pale. "Juno only ever barked once before," Daniel whispered. "The night Emma died." The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. Shadow wasn't just barking at George's truck. He was recognizing something. A pattern, a threat. The truck surged forward, its front bumper kissing their rear fender with a metallic screech. The impact sent them skidding, Hannah fighting the wheel as they careened toward the tree line. For one heart-stopping second, Eli was sure they'd crash. But then the tires caught, and they shot forward again. The quarry loomed ahead, its yawning black mouth just visible through the rain. No fences, no warnings, just a sheer drop into darkness. Hannah's voice was steel. "We're not making it to the quarry." Eli knew what she meant. They had one chance. As the truck roared up beside them, George's face visible for the first time, hard-eyed, jaw set, nothing like the broken father Daniel had described, Hannah did the unthinkable. She slammed on the brakes. The world spun, metal screamed. Shadow's weight crushed against Eli as they were thrown forward, the seatbelt cutting into his chest. The truck shot past them, its brakes locking too late as it skidded toward the quarry's edge. For one endless moment, Eli thought George would go over. But the truck stopped, its front tires hanging over empty air. Silence. Then, the driver's door flew open. George stepped out, and in his hand, glinting dully in the rain, was a gun. The rain fell in icy sheets as George Whitman stepped forward, his boots slipping on the muddy ground near the quarry's edge. The gun in his hand didn't waver, its barrel cutting a dark line through the curtain of rain between them. Eli's breath came in short, panicked bursts, his fingers digging into Shadow's fur as the dog let out another thunderous bark, a sound that seemed to shake the very air around them. This wasn't the quiet, broken man Myrtle had described. This was someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. Hannah threw open her door and stepped out, her hands raised. "George!" she called, her nurse's voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "Whatever you think is happening here, we can talk about it." George's laugh was a hollow, broken thing. "Talk? Like you talked to my boy? Like you plotted with him to steal what's mine?" His gaze locked onto Shadow, and for the first time, Eli saw something flicker in those cold eyes, not anger, but fear. "That dog belongs to me." Daniel stumbled out of the car, clutching his bleeding arm. "He was Emma's," he spat. "Just like the money, just like everything else you took from her." The gun swung toward Daniel. "You don't know what you're talking about, boy." Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. He should move, he should do something. But fear pinned him to the seat, his body refusing to obey. Shadow, though. Shadow was vibrating with tension, his muscles coiled like springs. His good eye never left George. Then, as if sensing Eli's paralysis, Shadow did something extraordinary. He turned and licked Eli's hand. Once, gentle, deliberate. A silent message. "It's okay." And then the dog was moving, slipping out of Eli's grasp and through the open car door like a shadow given life. George's gun tracked him instantly. "Juno!" he snarled. "Come." Shadow didn't obey, didn't even pause. He just kept walking, slow and steady, his paws sinking into the mud as he closed the distance between them. Eli's throat tightened. "Shadow." But the dog wasn't stopping. George's finger twitched on the trigger. "Last warning, mutt." Shadow kept walking, 10 feet, 5. Then, a sound cut through the storm, not a bark, not a growl, a whimper. The same sound, Eli realized with a jolt, that Shadow had made when Daniel mentioned Emma's death. George froze. For the first time. The gun lowered slightly. Shadow didn't attack, didn't lunge. He just sat down in the mud, right at George's feet, and looked up at him with those mismatched eyes, one clouded, one burning like amber in the storm's gloom. And then he did it again. That soft, heartbreaking whimper. George's breath hitched, his hand shook, and in that moment Eli understood. Shadow wasn't trying to fight, he was trying to remember, to remind George of something, someone he'd tried to forget. Emma. The realization hit George like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his face twisting. "No," he whispered. "No, you don't get to—" But Shadow just tilted his head, the way dogs do when they hear a voice they love. And George Whitman, the man who'd chased them through the storm, the man who'd raised a gun to his own son, broke. The gun fell into the mud. George dropped to his knees, and Shadow, ever patient, ever loyal, leaned forward and pressed his forehead against George's chest, just like he'd done with Eli that first day at the shelter. A sob ripped from George's throat. "I'm sorry," he choked out, his hands hovering over Shadow's fur like he was afraid to touch. "I'm so sorry, Emma." The rain fell harder. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, and Eli, watching from the car, understood the truth at last. George hadn't killed Emma, but he'd let her die, and Shadow, Juno, had known it all along. The sirens grew louder, their wails slicing through the storm like knives. Red and blue lights flickered in the distance, painting the rain-slicked trees in eerie flashes. Eli sat frozen in the car, watching as George Whitman crumpled in the mud with Shadow's weight against his chest, the man's shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from some deep, broken place inside him. It was a scene that didn't make sense. The same man who had chased them with a gun now looked like a ghost of himself, his fingers trembling as they hovered over Shadow's fur. Daniel stood a few feet away, his injured arm hanging limp at his side, his face unreadable in the flashing lights. Hannah was the first to move, stepping forward slowly, her hands still raised though the gun lay abandoned in the mud. "George," she said carefully, her voice steady but soft, the way Eli had heard her speak to patients in pain. "The police are coming. You need to decide what happens next." George didn't look up. His fingers finally touched Shadow's head, not gripping, not pushing away, just resting there, as if he was afraid the dog might vanish. "I didn't mean for her to die," he whispered, the words barely audible over the rain. I needed the money, the medical bills, the debt. I thought if I could just buy more time, get her the surgery in Switzerland." His voice cracked. "I didn't pull the trigger. I just didn't call for help when it happened." Eli's stomach turned. He had seen grief before, in his mother's eyes when they buried his father, in the way she sometimes stared at old photos without really seeing them. But this was different. This grief was poisoned with guilt, heavy and suffocating. Shadow whined softly, pressing harder against George, as if trying to physically hold him together. Daniel took a step forward, his face pale. "You let her die," he said, his voice hollow. "For money." George flinched, but didn't deny it. "I thought I was saving her," he rasped, "but I was just killing her slower." The sirens were close now. The first police car skidded to a stop behind George's truck, its headlights illuminating the scene in stark relief. An officer stepped out, his hand on his holster, his gaze flicking between the gun in the mud and the sobbing man on the ground. "Everyone all right here?" Hannah moved forward, her nurse's instincts taking over. "This man needs medical attention," she said, gesturing to George. "And my son and his friend are just bystanders. They're shaken up, but unharmed." The officer hesitated, then nodded, calling for an ambulance over his radio. Another cruiser pulled up, and suddenly the quarry was alive with movement. Paramedics, more officers, voices overlapping in the rain. Eli stayed in the car, his arms wrapped around himself, watching as George was helped to his feet, his hands cuffed behind his back not with force but with a grim sort of resignation. Shadow stayed at his side until the last possible moment, his tail low but his head high, as if he understood this was necessary. Then, as George was led to a police car, he turned back, his eyes finding Eli's through the rain-streaked window. "Take care of him," he said, his voice raw. "Better than I did." And just like that, he was gone. The storm began to ease as the police took statements, the rain thinning to a drizzle. Daniel sat on the bumper of an ambulance, a paramedic wrapping his arm in clean white bandages. Hannah spoke quietly with an officer, her posture weary but relieved. And Eli? Eli sat with Shadow in the back seat of their car, the dog's head heavy in his lap, his fur still damp from the rain. He thought about George's words. I didn't pull the trigger. I just didn't call for help. He thought about Shadow, Juno, who had known the truth all along, who had barked that night, who had tried to warn them, who had been locked away when it mattered most. And he thought about the tag on Shadow's collar. If you found me, someone still believes I matter. Maybe, Eli realized, it had never just been about Shadow. Maybe it had been about Emma, too. A soft knock on the window startled him. Daniel stood outside, his bandaged arm cradled against his chest. Eli rolled the window down. "You okay?" Daniel asked. Eli glanced at Shadow, then back at Daniel. "I don't know." Daniel nodded like he understood. "They're taking him in, fraud, negligent homicide. He won't be coming back." His voice was flat, but his eyes were wet. "I don't know if that's justice or just sad." Eli didn't either. Shadow lifted his head and licked Daniel's hand through the window, a quiet gesture of comfort. Daniel managed a small, broken smile. "He always did know how to make things better," he murmured. Then, after a pause, "You should keep him. He chose you for a reason." Eli looked down at Shadow, at his cloudy eye and his scars, at the way he carried his past but never let it weigh him down. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think I will." The ambulance doors shut. The police cars pulled away. And as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, Eli realized something else. This wasn't the end. It was just another beginning. The days after the storm passed in a blur of hushed conversations and restless nights. Eli found himself staring at Shadow more often than not, tracing the scars on the dog's legs with his fingertips, wondering how many of them were from that night, the night Emma died. The police had taken George away, and the town of Willow Creek buzzed with gossip, but no one seemed to know the full truth. No one except Daniel, who had disappeared after giving his statement, leaving nothing but a scribbled note slipped under Eli's door. "Take care of him. I'll be back when I can." The words were vague, but the desperation in them was clear. Daniel was running from something, and Eli had a feeling it wasn't just his father's legacy. Hannah tried to keep things normal. She made pancakes on Sunday morning, the way she used to before Eli's dad died, and she left the front door open so Shadow could wander in and out as he pleased. But Eli could see the shadows under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought he wasn't looking. The storm had shaken something loose in all of them. Then, one evening, the past came, knocking again. Eli was sitting on the porch steps, sketching Shadow in his journal, the way the dog's ears twitched when he heard a bird, the way his tail thumped once, lazily, when Eli scratched behind his good ear. The sun was setting, painting the sky in oranges and purples, when a car pulled up to the curb. Not a police car. Not Daniel's beat-up sedan. A sleek black vehicle with tinted windows that screamed money. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was tall, dressed in a tailored pantsuit, her dark hair pulled into a severe bun. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Shadow immediately, and Eli felt the dog tense beside him, his low growl vibrating through the wooden steps. "Eli Parker?" the woman asked, her voice crisp. Eli stood, his pulse quickening. "Yeah?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Victoria Whitman, Emma's mother." The name hit Eli like a punch. Emma's mother, George's ex-wife. Daniel had never mentioned her. Shadow's growl deepened, his body rigid. Victoria ignored him, stepping closer. "I heard about what happened with George. Nasty business." She sighed, shaking her head. "But I'm not here about him. I'm here about Juno." Eli's fingers curled into Shadow's fur. His name is Shadow now. Victoria's smile tightened. "Cute, but legally he's still Emma's dog, and as her next of kin that makes him mine." Eli's stomach dropped. What? She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded document. Proof of ownership. Veterinary records, microchip registration, all in Emma's name, now transferred to me. She held it out. I'd like him back. Eli didn't take the papers. He couldn't. His mind raced. Why now? Why, after all this time? Shadow pressed against his leg, his growl fading into a whine. Victoria's gaze flicked to him, and for the first time, her mask slipped. Something dark and unreadable flashed in her eyes. He was there that night, she murmured, more to herself than to Eli. He saw. A chill ran down Eli's spine. Saw what? Victoria blinked, her composure snapping back into place. Nothing. Just sentimental nonsense. She straightened, her voice turning businesslike again. I'll give you until the end of the week to say your goodbyes. Then I'm taking him. She turned on her heel and walked back to her car, leaving Eli standing there, the unread document dangling from her outstretched hand like a threat. As the car pulled away, Shadow let out a sound Eli had never heard from him before. A high, keening whimper, the kind that spoke of old pain, old fear. Eli knelt beside him, pressing his forehead to the dog's. I won't let her take you, he whispered. But even as he said it, he wondered, how do you fight someone who knows all the legal loopholes? And more importantly, why does she want Shadow so badly? The document sat on Eli's desk like a sleeping viper, its crisp legal edges stark against the worn wood. He hadn't touched it since Victoria left, hadn't even unfolded it, because opening it felt like admitting this was real. Shadow paced the room behind him, his claws clicking restlessly against the hardwood, his breathing just a little too quick. He hadn't relaxed since the woman's visit. Hannah stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face pale. We should call a lawyer, she said quietly. Eli shook his head. We can't afford one. We can't afford not to. She stepped forward, her fingers brushing the document. Eli, if those papers are real, they're not. The voice came from the hallway. Eli and Hannah turned as one. Daniel stood there, leaning heavily against the doorframe, his bandaged arm now in a sling. His clothes were rumpled, his hair wild, like he'd been sleeping in his car. His eyes, though, those were clear and furious. Daniel? Eli shot to his feet. Where have you? Doesn't matter. Daniel limped forward, his free hand reaching out to Shadow, who immediately pressed against his leg. Those papers are fake. Mom hasn't been Emma's next of kin in years. She lost custody when the divorce was finalized. Everything went to Dad. His jaw tightened. Which means she's bluffing. Eli's pulse pounded in his ears. Then why would she? Because she knows. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. She knows Juno saw what happened that night, and she's scared of him. A beat of silence. Hannah exhaled sharply. Daniel, what are you saying? Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, battered notebook, the kind with a spiral binding and pages yellowed with age. After the funeral, he said slowly, I found this hidden in Emma's room. I didn't understand it then. I think I do now. Eli took the notebook, his fingers trembling as he flipped it open. The first page held a single sentence, written in neat, looping script. If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Eli's breath caught. The next pages were a mix of journal entries and medical notes, dates, times, symptoms. Emma had been documenting her condition meticulously, but it was the last few entries that made Eli's blood run cold. Mom visited today. She brought supplements. Felt dizzy an hour later. Juno wouldn't stop barking. Another gift from Mom. Tossed it this time. She watched me like she was waiting for something. I think she's trying to kill me. Eli looked up, his vision swimming. Your mother, she was poisoning Emma? Daniel's face was stone. Slowly, so it would look like her heart gave out. He swallowed hard. Dad found out. That's why he locked Juno up that night, not because he didn't care, because he was trying to protect her. From Mom. The room spun. Eli gripped the desk to steady himself. Shadow whined, pressing closer. Hannah was the first to speak. We have to go to the police. Daniel laughed bitterly. With what? A dead girl's diary? They'll say she was paranoid, and Mom's got money, connections. She'll bury it. His eyes met Eli's. But she is scared of Juno. That's why she wants him, not because of legal rights, because he's the only witness left. Eli looked down at Shadow, at his scarred body and knowing eyes. The dog who never barked, except when it mattered. The dog who remembered everything. A plan began to form in Eli's mind, a dangerous one. Then we don't let her take him, he said softly. We make her confess. The plan was simple, terrifying, but simple. Eli sat in the back seat of Daniel's car, his fingers buried in Shadow's fur, as they drove toward the Whitman family's old lake house, the place where Emma had spent her last summer. The place where, according to Daniel, Victoria still kept a private office. The sun had long since set, painting the world in shades of blue and black, the road ahead illuminated only by the car's flickering headlights. Hannah had argued against this, begged even. But Eli couldn't let Shadow go. Not like this. Not without a fight. Daniel's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. She'll be there, he muttered. She always goes there on Thursday nights, thinks no one knows. Eli nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Shadow sat beside him, unnaturally still, his amber eye reflecting the passing streetlights like a flickering flame. He hadn't made a sound since they left. The lake house loomed ahead, a sprawling structure of wood and glass perched at the water's edge. A single light burned in an upstairs window. Victoria's car was parked out front. Daniel killed the engine. Ready? Eli wasn't, but he nodded anyway. They moved quietly, Shadow padding between them like a ghost. The front door was unlocked, a mistake or a trap, Eli wasn't sure. The house smelled of lemon polish and something sharper, medicinal. The floorboards creaked under their weight as they crept toward the study, where muffled voices filtered through the closed door. Victoria was there, and she wasn't alone. Eli pressed his ear to the wood, catching snippets of conversation. Deal with it, then. The dog's a liability. A man's voice, unfamiliar. I'm handling it, Victoria snapped. The boy won't let go without a fight, but I have ways to make him comply. A pause. Then the man again, colder. You should have taken care of this years ago. Shadow's growl was barely audible, but Eli felt it vibrate through the floor. Daniel's face was grim. He mouthed, now. Eli took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Victoria spun around, her eyes widening. The man beside her, tall, broad-shouldered, with a doctor's coat draped over his arm, froze. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Shadow stepped forward. Not running, not attacking, just walking, slowly, deliberately. His nails clicked against the hardwood as he crossed the room, his gaze locked on Victoria. She recoiled, actually recoiled. Get that thing away from me, she hissed. The doctor reached into his coat. Daniel lunged. Eli, now! Eli fumbled with his phone, hitting record, just as Shadow did the one thing he hadn't done since the night Emma died, the one thing Victoria was terrified of. He barked, not once, not twice, but over and over, sharp and deafening in the enclosed space, his body rigid with fury. Victoria stumbled back, her composure shattering. "Shut it up! Shut it up!" The doctor raised his hand, something glinted in his grip, and Daniel tackled him. Chaos erupted, shouting, scuffling. Shadow's barks turned frantic, his body blocking Eli from the fray as the phone kept recording, capturing every word, every threat, every damning admission as Victoria screamed. It was just supposed to look like her heart gave out. The dog wasn't supposed to be there. He saw. Then silence. The police arrived 20 minutes later. Epilogue. The lesson in the silence. The headlines came and went. Prominent physician and socialite charged in daughter's murder. Cold case reopened after shocking confession. Victoria and the doctor, Emma's former cardiologist as it turned out, were arrested. George, already serving time for fraud, was given a reduced sentence for cooperating with the investigation. Daniel moved back to Willow Creek, into his childhood home, which he promptly sold to pay for therapy, for himself, and for the strays he started fostering. And Shadow, he never barked again, but he didn't need to. Eli learned that sometimes the loudest truths are the ones spoken in silence, that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the will to act despite it, and that love, real love, doesn't abandon, doesn't betray. It stays, just like Shadow did. The day Eli turned 16, he got a tattoo on his wrist, a simple outline of a dog, one eye clear, one clouded. Beneath it, 3 words, "I still matter." And he did. They all did. The end. Moral lesson. The world may try to convince you that you're invisible, that your voice doesn't matter. But the truth, the right people will always hear you, even when you don't make a sound. And sometimes the quietest among us carry the loudest truths. Never underestimate the power of simply showing up, of staying, of bearing witness. That's how change begins.